Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I knew something was off the second I stepped through the entrance of that restaurant, the kind of place where even the air feels expensive, thick with aged wine and polished pride, where the walls echo with quiet, cultivated conversation, and every table arrangement is more about status than comfort. The lighting was low and warm, casting everything in that buttery gold tone people associate with exclusivity, the kind of glow that makes people feel just a little more important than they actually are. I saw the hostess glance up at me, clipboard in hand, professional smile already stretched too tight, and that's when I felt it, that flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the one that tells you something isn't right, but she's been told to smile through it anyway. I walked toward the table, heels clicking quietly against the tile, my fingers brushing against the edge of my clutch, just enough to keep my composure from slipping. There they were, Mark, my husband, sitting with that polite tension he always carried in his shoulders around his mother, and Linda, his ever-poised, immaculately dressed mother, perched like royalty at the head of the table. Her earrings caught the light in that calculated way, large enough to be noticed, but tasteful enough to be praised. Beside her sat her husband, Harold, who was mostly decorative in these gatherings, and around them were two of Linda's old friends, all sipping wine and exchanging pleasantries in the kind of rehearsed tone only practiced elitists seem to master. But what struck me cold wasn't the company or the atmosphere, it was the empty table. Or rather, the fact that it wasn't empty at all. Every seat was taken. Every chair accounted for. Plates, silverware, wine glasses already poured and placed. All except for me. There was no place set for me, not even an extra chair shoved to the side as an afterthought. Nothing. Just a table that said, in no uncertain terms, you don't belong here. For a heartbeat, no one said a word. The silence wasn't loud, but it was cutting, like a needle pressed under the skin. Then Linda turned to me with that awful, rehearsed half-smile she always wore like a weapon. She tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but dripping with disdain, and said, "Oh, Rachel, it seems there's been a mix-up. There wasn't a seat reserved for you. Maybe a budget place suits you better." Her words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, petty, foul, and impossible to ignore. I heard one of her friends snort behind her wine glass, barely hiding the chuckle. Mark's face tensed, but he didn't say anything, not right away, not fast enough, not the way he should have. And I felt it then, that familiar heat in my chest, the kind that used to make me clench my jaw and look away, the kind I've learned to swallow more times than I care to count. But this time, I didn't look down. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. I didn't even blink. Instead, I laughed loud, clear, real laughter that caught them off guard, enough to make Linda's smile twitch slightly at the edges. Because sometimes, when people try to humiliate you in front of a room full of witnesses, the most powerful thing you can do is laugh like they're the punchline in their own joke. "I see," I said, my voice calm and unbothered, not because I wasn't furious, but because I knew something Linda didn't. Something she couldn't possibly imagine with her narrow little vision of the world where power comes from pedigree and manners are used like daggers. "That's all right," I added, still smiling. "I just need a minute." Linda's brows knit slightly, confused by my composure, irritated by the lack of reaction she clearly wanted. Her insult was meant to sting, meant to draw blood, but I wasn't bleeding, not this time. I turned away slowly, walking toward the front of the restaurant, passing polished tables and hushed conversations, ignoring the eyes that followed me like I'd just been dismissed from court. My heels echoed a little louder this time, and maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was just justice catching up, but I swear, even the walls leaned in a little to hear what would happen next. As I reached the hostess stand again, I leaned in gently and said just loud enough for Linda to hear across the room, "Let me speak to the owner." And just like that, every eye turned, not because they knew what was coming, but because something in my tone said this wasn't the story Linda thought she was writing anymore. There's a very specific kind of cruelty that hides beneath politeness, one that doesn't raise its voice or slam its fist on the table, but instead slices you in half with a well-placed smirk and a carefully chosen phrase. Linda, my mother-in-law, had mastered that form of cruelty like it was a second language. She never yelled, never cursed, never openly insulted me, not in the traditional sense. She didn't have to. She could dismantle a person's self-worth with a raised eyebrow and a sideways glance across her wine glass, all while smiling sweetly enough to make anyone outside the family think she was simply being charming. But I knew better. I'd known for years. It started from the very first dinner I ever attended at their house, a polished affair with linen napkins, gleaming cutlery, and wine bottles older than most marriages. Linda had looked me over like she was inspecting a piece of furniture she wasn't quite sure belonged in her living room. She offered compliments the way some people offer condolences, forced, hollow, and laced with judgment. "That's such a practical dress," she said that first night, her tone soft, but her meaning hard as stone. "Very humble. You don't see that much anymore." I smiled, of course. I always did in those early days. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was imagining it, that I needed to give her time. But time only sharpened her tongue, and over the years, her remarks grew more pointed, more deliberate. Every family gathering, every holiday, every birthday dinner came with a fresh round of observations masked as kindness. "You know, Rachel, it's so refreshing to meet a woman who doesn't care about labels," she once said, gesturing subtly toward my handbag while her friends chuckled. "Not everyone feels the need to impress with designer things." She'd compare me constantly to other women, Mark's ex-girlfriend from college who had such a refined taste in art, or their neighbor's daughter who carried herself with such elegance, always with that faint note of condescension that told me I was being measured and found lacking. And when she wasn't comparing me to others, she was picking apart my choices, my career, my friends, my cooking, even the way I arranged flowers when I brought them over for Sunday dinner. "Sunflowers," she said once, as though I'd shown up carrying roadkill. Such a rustic choice. I bit my tongue more times than I could count. I swallowed pride like dry pills and smiled through conversations that felt like sandpaper against my skin. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth the fight, that keeping peace mattered more than proving a point, that it wasn't my job to win her approval. It was enough that Mark loved me, that we were happy, that I didn't need her validation to live my life. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about her approval. It was about dignity. About the way she tried, in her own quiet way, to shrink me just enough to feel taller in her own eyes. Have you ever had someone in your life who didn't need to shout to humiliate you? Someone who could ruin your evening with just one fake smile? Tell me in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one who's swallowed bitterness with a polite smile, nodding along while something inside you burned hotter with every passive jab. Maybe it was a boss, a friend, a sibling, a mother-in-law just like mine. Maybe you've also wondered what it would feel like to finally push back, not with rage, but with elegance, with precision, with the kind of quiet that speaks louder than any insult ever could. Because the truth is, Linda never saw me as part of her world. Not really. No matter how long Mark and I were married, no matter how many family events I attended or gifts I brought or holiday dinners I helped cook, she never let go of the idea that I was temporary, an outsider. Someone who had married into her life but never truly belonged in it. And in her mind, she made sure I never forgot it. That's why there was no seat for me at that restaurant table. That wasn't just a mistake, it was a message. A reminder that in her hierarchy of people who mattered, I didn't even rank. But what she never counted on, what she never even bothered to consider, was that I'd stopped trying to belong a long time ago. I didn't need her table, her approval, or her curated little world to define me. I had my own world, my own place, my own people. And unlike hers, mine didn't measure worth by silverware patterns or wine vintages. So when I turned from that table, after her smug little comment about budget places, I wasn't running away. I wasn't retreating. I was walking into a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't need permission to take up space. I walked through that restaurant with steady steps, past the polished wood and clinking glasses, past the judgmental eyes that barely knew me but thought they did. And without hesitation, I turned into the hallway leading to the kitchen, my voice calm and composed as I said, let me speak to the owner. Because the story Linda had been writing about who I was, where I belonged, and how small she thought I should be, was about to be rewritten. And I was going to be holding the pen. There's something beautiful about being underestimated, about watching people build an entire version of you based on their own narrow assumptions, only to later realize they never really knew a damn thing about you at all. Linda had spent years defining me through the lens of what I wasn't, what I didn't wear, who I didn't know, the circles I didn't move in. But she never asked, not once, what I had done before I became her son's wife. She never wondered what I did for a living beyond the vague title of consultant, and she certainly never imagined that the woman she dismissed as common and unsophisticated had helped build something far more refined than anything she had ever touched. Before I met Mark, long before I ever sat across a table from Linda and politely endured her wine-soaked superiority, I lived in a world that thrived behind the scenes. I was never the face on the poster or the voice on the microphone, but I was the engine underneath it all. I spent my 20s and early 30s working in hospitality, not just waiting tables or pouring drinks, which I did plenty of, believe me, but managing teams, creating concepts, and learning how the real power in the restaurant world is built quietly, behind kitchen doors and beneath the soft lighting of well-designed dining rooms. I didn't stumble into success. I earned it the long way, one bruised foot and sleepless night at a time. I worked in kitchens where the heat felt like punishment and on floors where entitled guests snapped their fingers like royalty. I studied menus like textbooks and memorized wine lists better than most sommeliers. And somewhere along the way, I met Sophia, an ambitious, sharp-as-glass visionary with a palate like a chef and the business acumen of a Wall Street shark. We were opposites in every obvious way, she loud and extravagant, me calm and composed, but we shared the same obsession with excellence and the same refusal to be dismissed by men who thought they owned the industry. Sophia had the connections and the flair, and I had the strategy and the structure. Together, we built a small consultancy and launched 2 boutique restaurants in the city before this one, Le Castain, became our crown jewel. I was the silent partner by choice, the one who preferred to work in shadows rather than sit in front of investors and shake hands with food critics. I designed the dining experience, trained the staff on language and gesture, helped develop the wine pairings, and curated the ambience down to the exact wattage of the lighting. Sophia always said I had an ear for the unspoken details, how a space should feel, how a dish should land on a table, how a good meal isn't just eaten but experienced in layers. But when I married Mark and moved to a quieter part of town, I took a step back. I kept my shares, stayed involved behind the scenes, but I stopped showing up at the tastings and PR events. My work didn't vanish, it just became invisible. And Linda, well, she never asked. Not once. She assumed that since I wasn't wearing a Rolex or name-dropping French designers, I must not be worth noticing. To her, I was just Mark's wife, someone who probably worked a desk job, clipped coupons, and couldn't tell the difference between a Burgundy and a Bordeaux. So when I walked into the kitchen that night, her smug insult still lingering in the air behind me, it felt like returning to a part of myself she never knew existed. The stainless steel countertops, the scent of garlic and butter, the sound of knives tapping rhythmically against cutting boards, it was like slipping into an old coat that still fit perfectly. And then I saw her, Sophia, leaning over a prep station, directing staff with the same intensity she always carried like a second skin. She turned when she heard my voice, and for a moment, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Rachel," she said, wiping her hands on a towel before pulling me into a quick, warm hug. "What the hell are you doing here?" I grinned, unable to hold back the wave of satisfaction rising in my chest. "Long story," I said. "Let's just say I got invited to a dinner I wasn't meant to enjoy." Sophia's eyes narrowed with curiosity as I gave her a short version of the events that had just played out in the dining room, and I watched the way her expression shifted from confusion to understanding to wicked delight. "Typical," she muttered, shaking her head. "People like that always assume they know who's worth impressing." I didn't want to cause a scene, I said, though the tone in my voice betrayed that I was no longer interested in just keeping the peace. Sophia tilted her head, a knowing smile playing on her lips as she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You want to have some fun with this?" she asked. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen that I helped design, with a woman who knew exactly what I was capable of, I realized that whatever came next wasn't about revenge. It was about reminding people like Linda that sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should have feared all along. There's a particular kind of hush that falls over a dining room when something shifts in the air, something subtle but undeniable, like the scent of a storm sneaking in through an open window. When I stepped out of that kitchen, calm and steady, Sophia walking just half a pace behind me, heads began to turn without anyone realizing they'd done it. You could feel the ripple move through the room, forks pausing midair, conversations dropping mid-sentence, wine glasses frozen just inches from lips. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. People could sense that something had changed, even if they didn't yet know what it was. I walked with a different posture this time, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because I didn't have to shrink myself anymore. The quiet part of me that had sat through years of carefully veiled insults and passive dismissal wasn't interested in being silent anymore. And beside me, Sophia was radiating the kind of energy that could bend a room's attention without saying a word. She wasn't dressed for the dining floor. Her hair was pulled back, her apron dusted with flour from prepping earlier in the evening, but there was no mistaking her presence. People recognized her face, even if they didn't know her name. She was the type of woman who carried reputation like a tailored coat, and I could already see the curiosity lighting up behind the glances from nearby tables. Linda was mid-laugh when she noticed me approaching again, her wine glass lifted, her voice high and false in that way she used when she wanted to impress someone just enough to feel superior. But the second she saw Sophia behind me, her expression faltered, not a full collapse, just a flicker, just a small clench of her jaw, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Her eyes darted between us, trying to gauge what she was missing, trying to rearrange her perception quickly enough to keep her dignity intact. But she was already too late. Sophia stepped forward, that confident gleam in her eye, and extended her hand toward me with a smile that was far too warm to be casual. "I'm so glad you're here tonight," she said, loud enough for every guest within earshot to hear. "We've missed your presence around here." Linda blinked, clearly caught off guard, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass. "You two know each other?" she asked, trying hard to make it sound like polite curiosity instead of panic. Sophia didn't even flinch. "Know each other?" she echoed with a small laugh. "Rachel helped create this place. She's one of the original minds behind our concept. The palette, the tone, the experience. This restaurant wouldn't be what it is without her." And just like that, the tone of the entire table shifted. The waiter, who had earlier greeted me with that clipped, dismissive tone, was now scrambling to retrieve a chair, unfolding a napkin with nervous hands and setting it beside Mark like he was suddenly afraid of making the wrong move. A fresh place setting appeared out of nowhere, as if it had been hiding just off stage this whole time, and a second waiter was already pouring a glass of the reserve vintage and setting it gently in front of me. I didn't even have to speak. My presence had finally started speaking for itself. Linda's expression was a masterclass in forced composure, her lips twitching between a smile and a grimace, her voice an octave too high as she said, "Oh, how surprising. I had no idea Rachel was involved in anything like this." Sophia gave her a look that was all teeth and silk. "She's never been the kind to advertise her worth," she said smoothly. "But some people don't need to talk about what they've built. What they've built speaks for them." That line hung in the air like incense, and I saw the flicker of recognition in the eyes of Linda's friends, those women who had once laughed under their breath at her barbs, now sitting stiffly in their chairs, not quite sure where to look. Even Mark seemed frozen for a moment, clearly struggling to reconcile the image he'd known of me for years with the woman who had just returned from the kitchen like she owned the place, because, in a way, I did. He leaned closer, his voice low, still laced with disbelief. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I turned to him with a soft smile, not bitter, not smug, just honest. "Because you never asked." And that was the truth of it. No one had ever asked. Not Linda, not her friends, not even the man I married. They all assumed I was content on the periphery, grateful to be tolerated at their table, never realizing I'd helped design the damn table they were sitting at. As dinner resumed, the conversation was strained, the laughter brittle, and every time someone tried to shift the focus back to more comfortable topics, it inevitably circled back to me, what I had done, how I knew Sophia, what my role had been in the restaurant's creation. It was subtle, but I felt the shift in power like a tide rolling in, silent but unstoppable. I didn't need to raise my voice or throw a tantrum. All I needed was the truth, finally visible, finally undeniable. Linda tried to recover, of course. She asked questions in that syrupy tone that always followed a failed power play. She made comments about how impressive it was, how nice it must be to be involved in something so trendy, but her eyes couldn't hide the sharp edges underneath. I let her have her performance. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge her. I just lifted my wine glass with a gentle smile, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "Funny how tables fill up when you know the right people." And just like that, I watched her world shrink a little, one perfectly plated bite at a time. The rest of the dinner unfolded like a symphony played out of tune, each note striking awkwardly, each pause in conversation heavy with the weight of what had already been exposed. No one could quite pretend the air hadn't shifted, though a few made pitiful attempts to stir it back into something resembling normalcy. Linda tried, in that restrained, overly practiced way of hers, to pull the conversation towards safer ground, but her tone was brittle, and the sharpness behind her eyes had grown too visible to hide beneath her usual veil of upper-class charm. She leaned into her old tricks, reaching again for her favorite weapons, snide remarks wrapped in soft laughter, offhand comments disguised as observations, and subtle comparisons meant to remind me, or perhaps herself, that she still held some semblance of superiority. "It must be a relief," she said at one point, her voice dipped in honey but laced with something sour, "to finally have a project that lets you step out of the shadows. I imagine it gets dull, staying behind the scenes all the time." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I simply tilted my head slightly, smiled without showing teeth, and replied in the same even, composed tone I had perfected after years of being dissected under her social microscope. "Some of us find satisfaction in building things, not just being seen near them," I said gently, and the quiet hush that followed was far louder than any argument ever could have been. Linda looked away first, of course. She always did when someone refused to play the part she'd assigned them. But that didn't stop her from trying again, making little comments throughout the evening that were meant to re-establish her footing, complimenting the wine selection as if it were a discovery she'd made, commenting on the decor like she hadn't just been told it was something I had helped design, even correcting Sophia on a menu detail in a tone that suggested she was just trying to be helpful. But every time she opened her mouth, it became clearer to everyone at the table that she wasn't in control anymore, and that awareness clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. I said little for the rest of the meal, not because I lacked things to say, but because I'd already said enough without saying much at all. There's a strength in silence, a discipline in not needing to fill every space with words just to prove a point. I had nothing left to prove, and that truth settled inside me like calm water after a long storm. I watched Linda drown in her own discomfort, watched her smile a little too tightly, laugh a little too loudly, gesture a little too broadly in an effort to recenter the spotlight she had lost. Across from me, Mark sat quieter than usual, his fork slowly scraping at his plate, his eyes flicking between me and his mother with a kind of dawning realization that was almost painful to watch. For years, he had brushed off her behavior as harmless tradition, old habits, or simply a generational gap. He hadn't seen the full scope of her dismissal because he'd never had to wear it on his skin the way I did. But now, watching her twist herself into polite contortions trying to reclaim a sense of importance, I could tell something was finally sinking in for him. He saw what I had carried quietly for too long. And for once, I didn't feel the need to explain it. He could see it now without me lifting a single finger. When the dinner finally ended, dessert barely touched and conversation worn thin, we all rose from the table with a stiff, forced grace of people pretending everything had gone smoothly. Sophia kissed me on the cheek and whispered something low and conspiratorial about the look on Linda's face being better than any soufflé she'd ever served. I didn't disagree. Linda said nothing as she slipped on her coat, but the bitterness in her eyes was unmistakable, like vinegar clinging to the rim of a crystal glass. Her silence wasn't elegant. It was spite wrapped in pearls, the last resort of a woman who had lost the only weapon she'd ever learned how to wield. On the ride home, the silence between Mark and me felt different, less strained, more reflective, like he was sifting through a box of memories and finally seeing them for what they had always been. The traffic hummed outside the car window, and I stared into the passing night, thinking not of what had been said that evening, but of everything I had chosen not to say over the years. The strength it takes to stay silent until the moment is right is a strength not everyone understands. Most people confuse silence with weakness, mistake composure for passivity, but there is power in restraint, a kind of quiet authority that shakes foundations without needing to shout. We pulled into the driveway, the soft crunch of gravel under the tires filling the air, and Mark didn't get out of the car right away. He just sat there, hands still on the steering wheel, eyes focused on nothing in particular, as if trying to make sense of what he had seen, what he had failed to notice for so long. Then he turned to me, his voice low and almost hesitant, and said, "Why didn't you ever tell me who you really are?" And I looked at him, held his gaze for a long moment, and simply said nothing because I wasn't sure if he was asking about the restaurant or something much bigger than that. There's something about quiet victories that linger longer than any outburst ever could, something about reclaiming your dignity without ever raising your voice that leaves a deeper imprint than any grand confrontation ever would. It had taken me years to understand that power doesn't always look like dominance or noise. It doesn't always come in the form of slammed doors or triumphant speeches or public showdowns. Sometimes, power is just the way you sit at a table they never meant to offer you, the way you hold your glass steady while others scramble to compose themselves, the way your silence makes more of a statement than their best rehearsed insult ever could. After that night at the restaurant, I didn't say much to anyone. Not to Mark, not to Sophia, and certainly not to Linda. I didn't gloat, didn't rehash the moment over breakfast or bask in the afterglow of my quiet triumph. I just let it be what it was, a shift, a subtle turning of the tide that didn't need to be narrated. Because I hadn't done what I did for spectacle or applause. I hadn't exposed my history or stepped forward to embarrass anyone. I hadn't planned to flip the script in some theatrical, revenge-fueled blaze. I had simply stood in a truth that had always been mine, and for once, I'd let it speak loud enough to be heard. Mark, to his credit, was quieter too in the days that followed. Something had changed in his eyes, something less about guilt and more about awareness, like he was seeing me with new clarity, or maybe just finally realizing all the things I'd never said weren't silence but restraint. He didn't press me for more details about the restaurant or my partnership with Sophia. He didn't ask for a play-by-play of what happened in the kitchen or how long I had kept all of this from him. He just moved more carefully around me, not out of fear, but respect. The kind that had been missing in small ways before, the kind that lives in tone and timing and how a person chooses to listen when they're no longer assuming they already understand you. And then, a few days later, it arrived, an envelope with no return address, no handwriting on the front, just a stiff, cream-colored card inside with my name typed neatly across the top. The note was short, vague, so painfully crafted it read more like a press release than a message between two people who had shared years under the same roof. Thank you for attending dinner. It was a pleasant evening. Wishing you well in your future endeavors. That was it. No acknowledgement of what had transpired, no direct apology, no mention of her comment or the seat she'd refused to reserve for me. Just a cold little nod in my direction, an offering of acknowledgement wrapped in polished avoidance. I held the card in my hand for a few moments, reading it twice not because I expected to find more, but because I wanted to feel whatever emotion it might stir in me. But there was nothing sharp, nothing bitter. Just a strange, quiet relief. I slid the card into the back of a drawer in my study, not as a trophy, but as a placeholder, a marker of the moment when even Linda had realized she couldn't ignore what she'd seen. She hadn't found the grace to apologize, but she'd been forced to recognize something. And sometimes that's enough. A week later, I returned to the restaurant, this time through the front door, dressed not for war but for comfort, walking arm in arm with Sophia, who had insisted on treating me to a proper evening without drama or family tension. We took our usual corner booth, the one with the soft lighting and the perfect view of the entire dining floor. The staff greeted us with quiet familiarity, not with pomp or ceremony, but with the kind of nods reserved for people who are woven into the fabric of a place. We drank wine, laughed about old stories, shared small plates, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to prove anything to anyone. About halfway through the meal, Sophia leaned forward with that mischievous glint in her eyes and said, "You know, I think that dinner might have been my favorite performance of the year." I laughed, not because she was wrong, but because she was exactly right. Not every act of revenge needs to be loud or cruel or dripping with venom. Sometimes, the most elegant revenge is just existing unapologetically in a place they swore you didn't belong, and doing so without ever needing to point it out. As we finished our meal, dessert melting slowly between sips of espresso, I happened to glance toward the entrance, and there she was. Linda, walking in with two of her garden club friends, all dressed in those same overly coordinated blouses and too tight smiles. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, probably searching for the best seat, the most visible corner, the table that said she still mattered. And then she saw us. For a second, our eyes met. Just a flicker, nothing more. She didn't nod, didn't wave, didn't smile. She looked away just as quickly and turned back to her conversation, pretending not to have noticed us at all. But her posture changed, just a touch more rigid, her voice a little thinner, her laugh a little too forced. I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my glass or send a message across the room. I just turned back to Sophia, smiled softly, and continued our conversation like she was a stranger we'd never met. Because in that moment, she was no longer the gatekeeper of any world I wanted to be a part of. She was just another woman walking into a restaurant she never realized I had helped build. Another woman lost in the illusion of control, still clinging to the belief that status is louder than substance. Tell me, was I cruel? Or just finally honest?